Okay, hi. So this is kind of the podcast-like format that I'm going to use to talk about my lesson plan in the Phase 3 lab assignment. So this is part 2 of the project where I reflect on my lesson plan. When looking at the TPACK model and how I implemented it into my lesson plan, I think what provides a good example of how I used it would be when I implemented the use of the Coach's Eye app. So I think when I implement that app in relation to using the gymnastics role, I think that it ties together with the learning outcome C20-5 and A20-2. Those two are the ones that are related to phys ed, and they talk about learning about the basic skills of gymnastic movements. So I think those are content knowledges that I'm using, and then by adding Coach's Eye, I'm adding a technology that helps and ties into that contact knowledge to make it easier for the learner. So where before I would just be implementing that contact knowledge through myself, I can use the technology to not only do it for me, but also gives it a more in-depth look for the students, as they themselves are now the center of their own learning and can critique themselves. Kind of gives them a different perspective, a better perspective than just a teacher just teaching. And to further on that, just looking at some of the implementations that I did use versus where I didn't use, I'll kind of start where the ones that I did use. I think the one that really kind of made sense for me to use was the e-learning component in the lesson plan. So I think with apps like Coach's Eye, I think it can be kind of revolutionary in phys ed for distance learners, because students can teach themselves and teachers can facilitate their learning. The modification that I did was that everything is used on video versus being in a classroom. But yeah, I think that reflecting on this lesson, like, it totally could be used for e-learning in phys ed, which isn't really used that much, because the student is now kind of seeing it themselves and seeing how to critique themselves. So it's kind of like almost eliminating the middleman with the teacher there. So it's definitely useful for distance learners, and that's why I made that particular implementation. I also connected my lesson plan to the Horizon report, and that was the midterm goal of deeper learning approaches. I think that it fits in with the Horizon report, my lesson, just because the students are taking control of their own learning. And it's one thing for a teacher to tell a student when perhaps they're doing something incorrectly or not exactly how they like it, but then when a student can see it themselves, they get a deeper understanding of what's actually happening, and it grows them as a learner. And that's why I connected it to deeper learning approaches. I also connected my lesson plan to the terms of use in digital citizenship. I think a lot in lessons now, we're using a lot of different apps, and we're very excited about using the apps. But I think it's also important when you're using certain apps that you understand certain terms of use to be, a digital citizen. And that's why I kind of put in that age gap use. You can't be 13 or under to use the app. I know it's not going to be a problem in this class, but I think it's something that's nice to know when you're using an app like Coach's Eye. I also added that it's important to talk to the students about the terms of use, just so they don't go off on their own and do things that are against the terms of use. I think the teacher has a fiduciary responsibility, so it's important that we're passing on the digital citizenship ideas onto our students as well. And then moving on to the components that I didn't use in my lesson plan, I guess I should start with consideration of digital access issues. I didn't include it because I think in most schools, iPads are becoming pretty common. I kind of took it as like a local question, and I think in Edmonton Public, they're pretty common to have iPads, and there is funding available to put in apps like Coach's Eye there. So I didn't add it, but yeah, that would be an issue if you're doing perhaps distance learning and they don't have the apps or the technological tools available to critique themselves. I also didn't address the maker movement with big ideas because I don't think that this lesson really fits in with the maker movement. I think that the lesson is a good lesson in that the student is learning on its own, but they're not. They don't have the freedom to make their own. It's not as hands-on. That's why I didn't add the maker movement and its big ideas. I also did not add the learning theories as well. I think it would have been interesting on reflection to look back on where it fits in which each learning theory, just because it starts off with a teacher kind of demonstrating the activity and then letting the students go off on their own. There is a bunch of divergent discovery in this as well, but there's also a point to the lesson. The teacher is trying to get the students to a particular objective. So that's probably perhaps why I didn't think to use the learning objectives, just because of the singular vision of the lesson. So that concludes part 2 of my phase 3 assignment, the lesson plan reflection. Thank you very much for listening, and hope you enjoyed, and have a great rest of your day.